Hey everyone, and welcome back to Bloody Angola. I'm your host, Jim Chapman, and today we are continuing with the 50 Shades of Evil series, and we're going to be traveling to the heart of the American Midwest, Wichita, Kansas, to examine one of the most chilling and deceptive serial killers in United States history, Dennis Rader, better known as the BTK killer. Now, I know what you're thinking. Jim, we already went to Kansas, and you would be correct. Although when I released 50 Shades of Evil Kansas, and I told you the story of the Carr brothers way back in February of this year, I had tons of people from Kansas reach out, and they let me know that while the Carr brothers for sure fit the profile of evil, if I wanted to cover the most evil monster from that state, I needed to cover Dennis Rader, also known as BTK. Well, you requested it, and I am delivering it. Now, for more than 30 years, this man walked among his neighbors as a trusted family man, a church leader, a Boy Scout troop leader, and seemingly an upstanding citizen. But behind that ordinary facade, there was a predator who bound, tortured, and killed at least 10 innocent people, and then tormented an entire city with taunting letters and packages that he would send to police and media. He even chose the name himself, BTK, bind, torture, kill, and for decades, he would get away with it. I'm going to cover everything in this episode: the investigation that spanned generations of detectives, his dramatic capture in 2005, the trial, his life behind bars, and by the end of this episode, you're going to have a complete picture of how evil can hide in plain sight in America's heartland. But before I begin, I want to take a moment in respect and remembrance of the 10 victims whose lives were stolen and the families who still carry that pain today. Their names are Joseph Otero, Julie Otero, Joseph Otero II, Josephine Otero, Catherine Bright, Shirley Vian, Nancy Fox, Maureen Hedge, Vicky Wiegerly, and Dolores Davis. These were real people, mothers, fathers, sons, daughters, friends, whose story deserves to fully be told. And that is exactly what I am going to do. So let's get into it with 50 Shades of Evil Kansas, BTK. Now, Dennis Rader was born on March 9th of 1945 in Columbus, Kansas. Columbus, a small town in Cherokee County. It's not far from the Oklahoma and Missouri borders, and he would be the oldest of 4 sons born to William and Dorothea Rader. His father worked as a Marine Corps veteran who took a job with the Kansas Gas and Electric Company, and his mother would be a stay-at-home mom, raising boys in what appeared from the outside to be a working-class, normal Midwestern household. The Rader family eventually would move to Wichita, Kansas. This was when Dennis was still very young, and they settled into what was a rapidly growing city that would later become a central hub for all of his horrific crimes. Now, Wichita in post-World War II times was a booming town. Aircraft manufacturing, strong military presence. In the tight-knit neighborhoods that made up Wichita, it was where people knew their neighbors, or at least they thought they knew them. Now, as a child, Dennis was described by those who knew the family as quiet and somewhat reserved. He attended Riverview Elementary School and later Wichita Heights High School, and teachers and neighbors would recall a boy who didn't stand out either in a good way or a bad way. He wasn't the class clown and he wasn't the troublemaker. He was just someone who kind of kept to himself more than most kids his age. He was an average student. He participated in Boy Scouts and seemed on the outside very shy, but a normal everyday kid when you coupled all the other extra stuff that he would do. But even in those early years, there were glimpses that would later take on a much darker meaning. Rader himself would later admit in interviews and court statements that he developed unusual sexual fantasies at a very young age. He spoke of being fascinated by bondage and restraint as early as the age of 9 or 10. He described fantasies involving trapping animals and imagining himself binding them with rope and torturing them. He later would recount an incident in which he became sexually aroused watching his grandmother wring the neck of a chicken. And he also claimed to have engaged in choking experiments with animals where he would say choke a cat until it passed out but not kill the animal. He would also experiment in voyeurism and secretly watch neighbors through windows. And keep in mind, this started in his preteen years, and I can tell you, as would any psychologist or criminologist, these behaviors are prototypical of someone who's going to grow up a serial killer. And it almost always starts with animal torture and peeping Tom incidents at an early age. So Dennis Rader's relationship with his father, it was reportedly strict, but it wasn't considered unusually abusive by standards of that era. William Rader would expect his sons to be disciplined and hardworking, and Dennis would learn early how to compartmentalize. He would present one face to the world, and he would have a whole nother face, a whole secret inner life that was filled with these dark fantasies. This ability to compartmentalize, it would become his greatest weapon as an adult. Now, in school, he showed interest in technical subjects and mechanics. He was known to be very smart, with an IQ later estimated in the above average range, although his academic report card, if you will, wouldn't reflect it. He also enjoyed drawing and created sketches, and he was actually very good at that, but this was a hobby that would resurface decades later when he sent hand-drawn images to police, very disturbing images, along with letters that he would send, and we'll get into that later. Now, by his early teens, Dennis would attend church all the time with his family. He was baptized and he became an active Lutheran. And what's really shocking when you look back at Dennis Rader's childhood is outside of the issues that nobody knew about, some of them I just told you about, on paper, it just seemed like an ordinary upbringing. There were no major trauma incidents, no extreme poverty in this family, and that's what makes his story unique. He wasn't created by horrific abuse or a broken home in the way that a lot of your serial killers would claim. Instead, something inside of his wiring was just way off. He learned very early in life how to be one person privately and one person publicly. And before we move on, I want to go a little deeper into the incidents as it relates to BTK in childhood, that if you were someone who knew what you were looking for, really screamed warning signs. So there's a classic warning sign in the criminology world that's known as the homicidal triad, which alongside bedwetting and fire starting was cruelty toward animals. Now, according to Rader's own accounts and investigative reporting drawn from his journals and police interviews, he started out by targeting stray cats and an occasional dog in his Wichita neighborhood and the surrounding rural areas of town. He would spot, lure, capture these animals, often carrying them to an abandoned barn or an isolated spot where no one could see him, and there he would practice binding their legs with rope or baling wire. He would restrain them in ways that left them completely helpless, exactly the kind of domination and control that fueled his sexual fantasies. He would describe later that he would tighten wires or ropes around their necks, slowly strangling them while watching them struggle. And he would sometimes loosen the pressure only to tighten it again, prolonging that suffering. In some instances, he actually would hang the animals. He would then dispose of the bodies casually, just tossing them into the ditch or leaving them on the roadside. And forensic psychologists who would later evaluate him, they would note that these early experiences appeared to be the first time Rader connected sexual pleasure with watching a living creature suffer or die. Just like the story I told you above, where he talked about watching his grandmother wring the neck of that chicken. Same thing. Rather than feeling horror or disgust like most any child would, he actually became aroused by the sight of that. Tells you how sick this guy was. And these incidents weren't isolated, where he did it and then he freaked himself out because he did it and he didn't do it again. Dennis Rader would do this with animals over and over and over again. Rader estimated he killed dozens of cats and dogs this way throughout his early childhood and early teens. And as I also said, he was very into voyeurism during this time as well. He would spy on female neighbors through windows while he was dressed in stolen women's clothing, and he would suffocate himself by binding his own hands and his own ankles and placing bags over his head to restrict his own freaking breathing. Now, everything I just told you, to me, it demonstrates how scary this guy was. This kid wasn't just being cruel for cruelty's sake. He was practicing. He was actually rehearsing these rituals of binding, torturing, and killing that would define his signature later on as BTK. The helplessness of these animals, the power he felt in controlling their final moments, and that sexual release that followed, it would become a drive for every single human murder he would create later on in life. And of course, no one knew this. On the outside, Dennis was attending school. He made good grades. He participated in the Boy Scouts. He was fishing, reading comic books, going to church, all the things kids do. No one had a clue how crazy this kid was. He kept this part of his life completely hidden, just as he would later hide those stalking incidents, planning, and killings from his wife and his kids. So by the time Dennis Rader entered his teenage years, this is in the late 1950s and early 1960s, these dark fantasies would take root and really grab him. He would attend Wichita Heights High School, where he was an average student academically, but he managed to stay out of trouble. He would work part-time jobs. He worked as a bag boy and a stocker at a local grocery store, and he would save money to buy his first car himself. It seemed like he was maturing pretty good on the outside. It was also during these years that his secret life would expand significantly. His voyeurism really got worse. He would drive around Wichita neighborhoods at night, y'all, a behavior he would call trolling, and he would just look for women to watch through windows. He would steal women's underwear from clotheslines, and he began collecting items that really fueled this fantasy. At home, he would continue to experiment with self-bondage, and Rader's sexual fantasies became increasingly detailed and increasingly violent. By puberty, he was already dreaming of tying up girls and women, assaulting them while they were bound and terrified, and he would later tell investigators these fantasies that played out in his mind were like a movie that he was directing. He developed a celebrity fixation on a popular actress at the time. Her name was Annette Funicello, and she was a Mickey Mouse Club star. And he said he couldn't help but imagine her bound and at his mercy, and he would start cutting out pictures of her in magazines, and he would take them and he would draw ropes and gags onto her images. Now, during all of this, Rader continued to be involved in church and Boy Scouts, and he seemed to enjoy the structure of that. And after high school, he would briefly attend college. He would drop out to go to the Air Force at the age of 21, and he would serve as an aircraft mechanic, travel all over the world doing that. When he gets back, he did eventually get his degree in college, and military life was kind of scary for Rader because when he would travel overseas, he would actually get hookers and stuff, and he would do all this bondage to them as part of the pay, I guess you could say. So he gets back from the Air Force and he actually takes a job with the Coleman Company. Now, Coleman, it's just who you're thinking. They are the largest supporter of outdoor and camping equipment in the United States now, and they were then. And it was during this time he was also still involved heavily with his church, and it was a local Lutheran church, and that's where he met Paula Dietz. Now, Paula was a few years younger than Dennis, and she came from a stable religious family. She worked as a bookkeeper, and friends and family, they would say that she was quiet, kind, devoted, someone who valued faith, family, and stability. And in 1970, they start dating. And by all accounts, it was a pretty traditional courtship. They attended church together, they spent time with family, and they presented like they were a wholesome Midwestern couple. Rader would propose, and they were married on May 22nd, 1971 in a Lutheran ceremony. Now, Paula was 23, Dennis was 26, and photos from that marriage, from the wedding actually, would show a smiling young couple. Dennis in a dark suit, Paula in a modest wedding dress, and they looked like any other newlyweds you would see anywhere else in the country. But what makes this marriage interesting in hindsight is how completely Rader was able to hide who he was from his wife. To Paula and their families, he was a hardworking, church-going husband. He held steady jobs, first with the Coleman Company and then later with ADT Security Services, installing home alarm systems, a position that would ironically give him intimate knowledge of home security vulnerabilities that he would later exploit. And he was able to hide all of who he was from these people. Now, shortly after marriage, the couple moved into a modest home in Wichita, Kansas. On the surface, everything seemed great. Rader worked days, came home in the evenings, participated in church. Paula would manage that household. They attended church regular, and Dennis became very active in the church leadership over that time. Yet, during this exact period, the early years of the marriage, Rader's fantasies would intensify dramatically. He would continue trolling neighborhoods, stealing lingerie, practicing bondage on himself, and scouting potential victims. His job with ADT, that would allow him to case those homes under the guise of professional work. And the mask that he wore for Paula was nearly perfect. In 1975, they welcomed their first child, a son named Brian. 3 years later, in 1978, their daughter Carrie was born. And Rader often spoke later about how much he loved his children, how proud he was of his family life, and he participated in typical fatherly activities, Boy Scouts with his son, family outings, holidays. Paula raised the children primarily while he worked, but when he was off of work, he would do a lot of things with them. Just seemed very typical. And Rader would claim in later interviews that he truly loved Paula and his children, and that other side was completely separate. He described his double life as two different people sharing the same body. Now, by the time their first child was born in 1975, Dennis Rader had already committed his first murders. By the early 1970s, his fantasies, they just were no longer enough, y'all. He began planning and scouting potential victims. He installed alarm systems for ADT starting in 1974, and that job gave him the access that he needed, and it was perfect as far as a professional role to cover for these dark activities. Now, psychologically, Rader was developing what experts would describe as a narcissistic and sadist personality. He craved power, he craved attention, but was also highly organized and very patient. And these traits allowed him to operate undetected for so long. He learned to compartmentalize perfectly. Loving father and husband at home, church council member, compliance officer, all the things, while secretly nurturing a predator's mindset. Now, by 1974, at the age of 28, Dennis Rader was ready to cross from fantasy into reality. The ordinary Kansas boy with the secret life of cruelty and control was about to unleash horror in a city he called home. So I'm going to take you to the morning of January 15th, 1974, a quiet Wichita neighborhood, and Dennis Rader is going to take the irreversible step from fantasy to reality. What happened inside that small home at 803 North Edgemore Drive that day would shock the city and mark the beginning of a reign of terror that would last decades. The Otero family had moved from Wichita from Puerto Rico just a few years earlier. Joseph Otero, who was 38, was a U.S. Air Force veteran who worked as a mechanic, very similar to Dennis Rader. His wife, Julie Otero, she was 34, and she was a stay-at-home mom, and they had 5 kids in total, but on that morning, 4 were home. Joseph Joey Otero, he was 9. Josephine Otero, she was 11. Danny, who was 5, and Carmen, who was 4. Now, Rader had been stalking this family for weeks. He later admitted he chose them partly because of their ethnicity. He nicknamed the case, and he would call these cases, he nicknamed this one Project Little Mex, and he had driven by the house multiple times, noting the routines of the family, what time they got home, what time they went to work, what time they woke up, what time they had visitors there, all the things. This guy was methodical with that. And on that very cold January morning, he would cut the phone lines, approach the back door, and force his way inside that home at 8:30 a.m. He would claim he was a fugitive who needed food, money, and a car, and he didn't realize that Joseph Otero Sr. was still at home during this time. What followed was a calculated, brutal attack. It lasted for 2 to 3 hours. Rader would use cords from Venetian blinds and other items in the home to bind those family members, and he would separate them strategically. He put Joseph Sr. and Julie in the bedroom. The children were moved in other bedrooms, and he first focused on Joseph Sr., obviously being the biggest threat. He placed a plastic bag over his head and tightened it while also using a cord around his neck. Now, Joseph fought desperately, but he would eventually succumb to that suffocation. Julie Otero, she was strangled next, her hands bound behind her back, and Rader would later describe in court how Julie briefly regained consciousness after he thought she was dead, forcing him to strangle her again. The children, they witnessed this unimaginable horror. 9-year-old Joey was suffocated with a bag and a cord in the same room as his parents because Rader then brought him into that room. 11-year-old Josephine, she was taken into the basement and hanged from a pipe using a cord around her neck, and he later admitted to masturbating over her body as she died, a signature that would appear in several of his later crimes. Simply horrific. Now, the family was left bound and partially covered, and Rader would attempt to clean up some evidence, but he left behind critical clues, including semen and fibers that would link him to the scene years later when DNA would become a thing. And like almost all serial killers, he also took some personal items with him as trophies. Now, the surviving Otero children returned home later that day, and they actually discovered this nightmare. And of course, police were called, all those things. The community shocked at this. This was a city, Wichita, that prided itself on safety during this time, and suddenly they felt very vulnerable. This wasn't a random burglary gone wrong. It was too brutal to be, and everyone sensed it. And Rader's planning on this, y'all, was meticulous. He used his knowledge from ADT and his military background. He wore gloves. He brought some tools with him, and he used some tools around the house because he didn't expect that many people to be there. But he did make some mistakes. He stayed in that house far too long, literally hours, and he left DNA evidence on the scene as well. He later would send letters about that crime, and those letters would eventually help to catch him. Now, in later confessions, Rader would describe the Otero murders with a detached, almost clinical tone. He admitted the sexual gratification he got from the power and control, and with the family representing his first full realization of the fantasies that he had held since childhood, binding, dominating, taking life while watching terror in his victim's eyes, that was intoxicating to this monster. After this quadruple homicide, Rader goes home to his own young family as if nothing has ever happened, and he would later say he felt a rush of power after that. He felt like he had completed his, quote, project, and that would only fuel his confidence. He had crossed a line, and there was no going back. And the police, of course, they start investigating this, but because the killer had disabled the phone lines and he had effectively subdued an entire family at gunpoint, he also didn't leave any signs of forced entry. Detectives thought, man, this is too professional to be just some random murder of an entire family. The Otero family, somewhere in there, the police were convinced there was some ties to like gangs or some sort of cartel, and that's what they thought this was. They thought it was a professional hit. They thought it had to be because they had no other evidence on the scene. And that's kind of the direction they took the investigation, which we know it wasn't. 3 months later, after the brutal murder of the Otero family, Dennis Rader would strike again. On April 4th of 1974, he targeted 21-year-old by the name of Catherine Bright. Now, Catherine, just a young lady trying to build her life in Wichita. She worked at a local company in the area, and everybody knew her as a friendly personality. She was close with her family, especially her brother Kevin, and she had recently moved into a house at 3217 East 13th Street with her brother. Now, her brother and her had went shopping this particular morning, unbeknownst to Rader. So Rader had been trolling neighborhoods, looking for opportunities, and he later admitted he chose Catherine partly because she lived relatively close to the previous targets, and she fit his victim profile. She was a young woman. She appeared to be living in a vulnerable situation, and he started scouting her home in advance. So Rader enters that home through the back door. This is around midday. And when Catherine gets home, he is waiting for her. However, she came home with her brother, who, as I told you, she had been shopping with. And BTK, he's kind of shocked by this. He had prepared perfectly, studying her every routine, and this was not expected. So BTK pulls a gun. He tells the brother and sister he's an escaped convict. He needs a car and some money. And hey, I'm just going to tie you up, take your car and any cash and leave. So he ties Kevin up and his sister Catherine, and they were placed in separate bedrooms. So while BTK is in Catherine's bedroom strangling her, Kevin breaks free of his bindings. BTK hears this. He goes into the bedroom where Kevin is, and they start fighting. And believe it or not, Kevin actually wrestles the gun away from BTK. But sadly, BTK was able to regain control of that gun, and he shoots Kevin in the head. He thinks he's dead. He turns to leave, and Kevin actually jumps back up, and they go to fighting again, and BTK shoots him a second time. This time, surely this guy's got to be dead. So he goes back to Catherine. In the middle of it, strangling Catherine, he hears the front door open, and it's Kevin. He's shot twice, but he's running out the front door. So he kind of chases after him for a second. This kid is down the road at this point. So he turns around and he knows my time is limited. He goes back to Catherine, and rather than strangling her and taking more time, he takes a knife and he stabs and kills her. But her brother would survive. and he was able to provide a description to police. And he would say later that he did not like stabbing, and I'm talking BTK here, as a form of killing because he would say it was too messy, and he vowed to never carry a knife again. I mean, this one was sloppy all around, and it enraged BTK. He just felt he was too smart for that. He was arrogant. A lot different here than the Otero killings, the use of a knife, the victim getting away, one of the victims. So not much would initially connect here in the eyes of the police. And I felt like, how can you not at least suspect these were related? But police did not relate the two at the time. So the crime scene at Catherine's home, of course, would show signs of a fierce struggle. There were blood in multiple rooms, overturned furniture, evidence of Rader's attempts. He did try to clean up a little bit. And again, he took some trophies, including personal belongings that held sentimental value to Catherine's family. Now, her brother's survival provided one of the earliest eyewitness descriptions of the killer. A white male, approximately 5'8" to 6 feet tall, with a stocky build. However, still no DNA technology at this time, and police, they just didn't connect the cases. And for Rader, the Bright murder was both a success and a learning experience. He had completed what he called another project, but the resistance and the fact that Kevin survived taught him to be more careful, and he would refine his approach in future attacks. He would often bring more binding materials in the event that somebody was there he didn't expect, and he would also rely less on firearms. And in the years that followed, Rader would occasionally reference Catherine in his communications with police, showing just how narcissistic this guy was and the recognition that he wanted for killing these people. He wanted to make sure the police knew, hey, I killed that girl. Now, the gap between the Otero and the Bright murders was short. And it, you know, if they would have connected these, they would have thought another one's coming in short time. But after Catherine, Rader would go quiet for a while, at least in terms of known killings. Maybe because the fact that Catherine was so tough and didn't just roll over for him and accept her fate, Rader would just return to his normal life as a husband, father, and employee, all while the city of Wichita was living in fear of a killer who seemed to strike without any pattern. And there would actually be a 3-year lull following the murder of Catherine Bright. And that is very interesting to me because he would have a couple of lulls here throughout all of this. Totally unlike any other serial killer I've ever studied, and I've studied hundreds. Usually when they get that taste, that thirst for death, it is uncontrollable to them, and there's no way they're going 9 months, a year in between killings unless they're in jail or their life is going so perfect that they don't want to mess it up. They usually can't control it. In his case, it seems like he could, at least until March 17th of 1977. Now, his next victim was 24-year-old Shirley Vian, a mother of 3 young children. And Shirley was a Wichita mother just doing her best, y'all, to raise her children. They were 4, 6, and 8. All of this while dealing with her own personal challenge. She lived in a small home at 1311 South Pinecrest, and neighbors would describe her as friendly and devoted to her kids. Now, on that March afternoon, Rader had been trolling that area and selected her home after observing her routine for quite a while. He knocked on the door, and when she answered, he claimed to be a private detective, and he needed to talk to her about an urgent matter. Once inside the home, he quickly took control of her at gunpoint and her 3 young children all at home during this time. So they start panicking. He's thinking this isn't going to work. He tells her, look, we've got to do something with these kids. Let's put them in the bathroom and we'll put some toys in there and they can play with the toys and they won't be distracting. Then he starts claiming, look, I'm only going to rape you. I've got a sexual problem, but I'm not going to kill you, essentially. And so they take the kids, they put them in the bathroom, they put the toys in there. She actually helps him tie the bathroom door shut with a cord. She's wanting to do, this poor lady wanting to do whatever she could to make sure her kids weren't harmed. Now, sadly, the children could hear their mother scream and the struggle going on outside of that bathroom door. Rader would bound her with a rope and a cord and strangle her with it. And as in previous attacks, he would masturbate at the scene after killing her. And he spent a lot of time in the home, taking trophies, including some of Shirley's personal items, and he would leave behind semen evidence, y'all, that would later link him through DNA. And keep in mind the time frame here, it's the 70s. Nobody could foresee that there would come a point, a time in history where your semen could be used to connect you to a crime, unless you were a scientist maybe or something working on DNA technology at that particular time in history. So it seems careless now when you look back on it, but at the time, who would have thought? Now, the children would be locked in the bathroom for hours until they were finally discovered. The trauma that they endured, I can't imagine hearing their mother's final moments. And they would actually become key witnesses in the long-term investigation, but they were too young at the time, y'all, to provide a really detailed description of the suspect. Now, after this murder, parents would become hyper vigilant, and police, they're figuring out, Houston, we got a problem. They form a task force. But without modern forensic tools like DNA, the killer would remain elusive to say the least. And Rader returned to his normal life, still working at ADT, attending church, raising his own young children with Paula. So let's fast forward just 9 months to December 8th of 1977, and this is when Dennis Rader claimed his 7th known victim. 25-year-old Nancy Fox, she was a young professional woman living by herself in Wichita, and her murder stands out because Rader would later describe it as one of his most perfect projects. He meticulously planned this one and executed it with a level of control that would feed his ego for years. Now, Nancy, she lived in a small apartment at 843 South Pershing Street. Rader had been watching her for a good while, adding to his growing list of projects, and he studied her every routine, noting when she came and went from work and home, her friends, etc. And on that December evening, he would break into her apartment while she was out and about, and he waited patiently for her return. When she arrived, he confronted her again, telling her that he was a wanted fugitive who needed help. And Nancy, like Catherine Bright before, she was not going to be a victim easily. She fought back, but Rader did eventually overpower her. He would bind her hands and feet with items from his own home, cord and stockings from her home, and he would use the binding techniques that he had absolutely perfected by this point. He strangled her with a ligature, and as in previous crimes, he would masturbate on that scene after killing her. He took trophies, including some of her lingerie and personal items, which he kept in a secret stash for years. And what made this murder particularly significant for Rader was the communication that followed. In early 1978, he would send a detailed letter to a TV station, and in that letter, he would claim responsibility for Nancy Fox's death. And this is also where he became known for the first time as BTK. Bind, torture, kill, and he actually gave himself that name because he's an arrogant piece of shit, and he would start taunting police in the media. So initially what he did was he sent a poem to a newspaper about the Vian murder, but they didn't print it. They didn't do anything with it. And this pissed Rader off. So he sends another letter and he resends the original poem. And this is pre-email, y'all. This is actual letters received by the newspaper with stamps on the envelope and everything. And here is how that first letter received read after the murder of Nancy Fox. I find the newspaper not writing about the poem in the Vian murder unamusing. A little paragraph would have been enough. I know it's not the news media's fault. The police chief, he keeps things quiet and he doesn't let the public know there's a psycho running around, loose, strangling mostly women. There are 7 in the ground. Who will be next? How many do I have to kill before I get my name in the paper or some national attention? Do the cops think all these deaths are not related? Golly gee, Yes, the MO is different in each, but look hard, a pattern developing. The victims are tied up. Most have been women, phone lines cut. Bring in some bondage and sadist tendencies. No struggle and no witnesses except for the Vian kids. They were very lucky. A phone call saved them. I was going to tape the boys and put plastic bags over their head like I did Joseph and Shirley and hang the little girl. God, oh God, what a beautiful sexual relief that would have been. Josephine, when I hung her, it really turned me on. Her pleading for mercy when the rope took hold. She was helpless, staring at me with wide, terror-filled eyes while the rope was getting tighter and tighter. My short poem of death and maybe a drawing and later a real picture and maybe a tape of the sound will be coming your way. How will you know it's me? Before a murder or murders, you will receive the initials BTK. And as I told you, a poem was included. He titled this one, Ode Death to Nancy. And it says, what is that I can see? Cold icy hands taking hold of me. For death has come, you all can see. Hell has opened its gate to trick me. Oh death, can't you spare me? Over for another year, I'll stuff your jaws till you can't talk. I'll bind your legs till you can't walk. I'll tie your hands till you can't stand. And finally, I'll close your eyes so you can't see. I'll bring sexual death unto you for me. Signed, BTK. So this letter, y'all, provided details only the killer could know, and that confirmed the connection between the cases. And detectives do this a lot. They will talk to the press and they will give them only so much information about a murder, and that's intentional because they want to be able to identify the actual killer, and they know that person is going to have details we never released. That was the case here. There were some things he mentioned that nobody outside of the killer would have known. Could have been the fact that this young, poor girl was hanged in a basement, and maybe the police didn't release that, but he sure mentioned it in his letter. Now, for investigators, it was a breakthrough, and it was also a frustration. They confirmed they were dealing with a single killer across multiple cases, but it also mocked their inability to catch him, and the letter contained enough details to prove, as I said, that it came from the killer. Rader later admitted that the Nancy Fox murder and subsequent letter gave him an enormous thrill. He talked about the power he felt, not just in taking life, but controlling the narrative through the media, and it became almost as addictive, he said, as the killings themselves. And in the years that followed, he would send more communications, more poems, more packages, all while living this double life as a family man and a community member, and the gap between Nancy Fox and his next known victim would stretch all the way to 1985, one of several cooling off periods where Rader would focus on work, church, and his family while the city tried to heal. And as I told you, that's pretty unique to Rader. All the serial killers I've researched, nearly all cases, once these animals get a taste for death, it becomes undeniable. They lose complete control of it, and Rader was absolutely different in this respect. And that is where I'm going to leave this one for today. Next week, we're going to continue. We're going to wrap this one up, actually. We're going to go to 1985 and who would become the 8th victim of BTK. It just gets more disturbing from here. And quickly, y'all, I have been sleeping great for about 6 months now. And I've never been a good sleeper, but I switched to bamboo bedding and a bamboo comforter. And I'm telling you, it has changed my life practically. No joke. I love the sheets and comforter and pillowcases so much that this is what I did. I called Cozy Earth. I told them I was a podcaster, and I wanted to see if they would offer my listeners a special listener-only deal. And I told them, I don't want no bullshit 10% off. I want a real deal, and I'll promote it so that y'all can get that deal. And right now, if you go to CozyEarth.com and use the code EXPOSED at checkout, you're going to get 30% off anything you buy. They don't just have bedding either, y'all. They have pajama sets, towels, all kinds of things. You got to check it out. All this bamboo, soft, cool material. Just go check it out. Trust me, you're going to love it. And you get 30% off just by using my code exposed at checkout. That's cozyearth.com. And with that, thank you so much for listening. Check out the Patreon for commercial-free early releases and more at patreon.com/Bloody Angola podcast. And until next time, for Bloody Angola, I'm Jim Chapman. Much love.